Yesterday I outlined very briefly the mathematical structure, the physical interpretation and use of these structures in the case of classical mechanics, trying to bring out the uses of Lie groups and Lie algebras and the way they are the most useful tools for describing symmetry properties of physical systems. You probably realized that the mathematics used in classical mechanics has a particular flavor. It is, you can say, geometric in spirit. At least that is the way it is presented nowadays. Today I want to talk about analogous questions in quantum mechanics, and you will see as I proceed that the mathematical objects, the structures used in quantum mechanics are really quite different from those we are used to in the classical case, though there are efforts always going on to express even quantum mechanics in a geometrical language. One important point to keep in mind is that the physical interpretation of the mathematics that is used in quantum mechanics is very non-trivial. It is highly non-trivial, and I do not have the time at all to enter into such questions. So I will just have to tell you, and you have to take it on faith from me, what is the kind of mathematics used in quantum mechanics. I cannot explain in any detail why that is so, but if my distinguished colleagues in physics will make an attempt to answer some of your questions, that would be very welcome. From the mathematics point of view, there is something very attractive about quantum mechanics, which I think all of you would appreciate. It makes very important contacts with group representation theory. That is a characteristic feature of quantum mechanics, and so that is a very appealing feature. Okay, so now let me go into the mathematics of this subject. For a given quantum mechanical system, maybe it is a single electron moving around in an atom, maybe it is a pair of electrons, maybe it is a proton, maybe it is a hydrogen atom. Whatever the quantum system may be, there is a complex Hilbert space script H, which is used to describe the states of the given quantum system. The dimension of this space may be finite or it may be infinite. It depends on the nature of the system you are dealing with. Just to give very simple examples, suppose you are dealing with the motion of a point particle, let us say in one dimension. It can run anywhere from minus to plus infinity along the real axis. Then the Hilbert space that is used in quantum mechanics to describe the states of that particle is infinite dimensional. On the other hand, at the other extreme, suppose you want to describe what is called the spin of a particle, spin of the electron or spin of the proton, neglecting all other properties, then it turns out you need just a two-dimensional Hilbert space to describe just that property of the electron or the proton. So, all I am trying to say is that the nature of the Hilbert space, its dimension, the way it is built up for practical calculations are all determined by the nature of the quantum system that you wish to describe. As I said yesterday, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions, especially today, because I would imagine this is not very easy to understand if it is the first time you are hearing about quantum mechanics. Now, I will denote vectors in this Hilbert space by symbols psi, phi, Greek letters generally, and I will denote the inner product sometimes in this notation a round bracket with phi comma psi, or sometimes with the Dirac notation with angular brackets. There is one convention regarding the Hilbert space inner product which can cause confusion. Mathematicians invariably assume that in a complex Hilbert space, this inner product is linear in the first argument and antilinear in the second argument. Physicists always use the opposite convention, so you must be aware of it. Now, take a vector psi in the Hilbert space. So, I have some quantum system in mind. Its description uses some Hilbert space, and now all the comments I make relate to that system and its Hilbert space. So, take a vector psi in the Hilbert space and assume its norm is 1. Then one of the postulates, one of the features of quantum mechanics is that each unit vector determines a definite pure state of the system. What do we mean by the word pure in this context? In quantum mechanics, a state is said to be a pure state if it allows you maximum possible information about the properties of the system in that state. You may remember yesterday in the classical regime, for any given physical system, we said that all its physical properties are real valued quantities, and in principle for a classical system, you can have a situation, you can have a state where every physical property has a definite numerical value. Then you would say all physical properties of the system possess simultaneously corresponding numerical values. Now, in quantum mechanics, from this point of view, there are restrictions. For a given system, it is never possible for all its physical properties to be assigned definite numerical values. This is never possible. So, a pure state is by definition a state in which as many physical properties as possible are assigned definite numerical values. So, this is the concept of a pure state. It is a very subtle notion. If you have never come across it earlier, it will be difficult, but at least I have tried to explain it in clear language, and if there are some questions a little later, I will be more than happy to discuss this with you. One other important feature which will show up again very soon is the following. You realize that we have a complex Hilbert space. The use of complex numbers in this context is essential for the structure of quantum mechanics. This is something you must accept, and you may try to understand it more deeply as you study the subject more and more. So, in that context, here is an important physical fact. A vector psi of unit norm and a phase factor times psi always determine the same pure state. I repeat, a pure state for a quantum system is a condition of the system or a state of the system in which you have maximum permitted knowledge of the values of its various properties. Pure states do not correspond in a one-to-one manner to unit vectors in Hilbert space. It is true that given a unit vector, there is a corresponding pure state, but the unit vector psi and any phase factor times psi always determine the same pure state. Okay. So, this is something which you just have to accept, it is so. Next principle is a superposition principle of quantum mechanics. It says, suppose you take vectors psi 1, psi 2 and so on in the Hilbert space. You may imagine, you may assume each one of them is of unit norm, and suppose you take complex numbers C1, C2 and so on. You can construct this vector C1 psi 1 plus C2 psi 2 and so on. And since you have a complex linear vector space, this expression gives you in general a new vector in the same Hilbert space. Assume that this psi on the left is non-vanishing, then you can adjust its norm so that it becomes normalized, and then this becomes a new pure state. So, now there is some abuse of language involved here, but I will just say it in these words. One can make it much more precise. Given pure states psi 1, psi 2, psi 3, etc., the superposition principle says there is a way to combine them, combine in quotation marks, multiplying each one by a complex number and then using the vector space property to produce a new pure state. So, from given pure states you can produce new pure states. As I said, this statement is not really precise, but I say it for effect in this way. You can debate later why is it that this is not exactly true. Okay. Now, a couple of comments about the nature of the Hilbert space itself. Typically, as I said, the nature of the system you wish to discuss, you wish to describe, determines how to build up the corresponding Hilbert space. Typically, what happens is that once the system is chosen, there is a set of physical properties of the system which may be thought of as primitive, in the sense all other properties can be built up out of the primitive ones. These primitive physical properties are represented by Hermitian operators on a Hilbert space, and they obey typically some system of commutation relations or maybe some other algebraic relations. So, the system determines an algebra of operators, and the Hilbert space is chosen so as to give you, so as to carry an irreducible representation of all those operators obeying given commutation relations or other algebraic relations. So, yeah. The meaning of the word pure is that it is a state in which as many physical properties as permitted can all be assigned definite numerical values. So, as I said, see, because this subject is very new to so many people, I encourage the discussion, but you must not limit the time too much. In the classical case, as we saw yesterday, all the physical properties of a classical system in principle could have definite numerical values. So, all of classical mechanics deals with real number valued variables. In quantum mechanics, that is not true. We have to deal with things at in a much more subtle way. So, for a quantum system, there will never be a situation where all its imagined properties can all be assigned real numbers. You will never have a situation where the position of the electron, the momentum of the electron, the energy of the electron all have definite numerical values. Now, this is, by the way, the so-called conventional interpretation of quantum mechanics. There are attempts to go beyond it also, to replace it with something else. I am not going into that. So,
sorry, are these linear maps from H to C?
Which?
Position.
They are linear operators on H to itself. They are not maps from H to C. So, the physical properties of a quantum system are not real number valued quantities. That is point number one, you have to accept it. What are they from the mathematical point of view? They are elements of a non-commutative algebra. They are, we always picture them as operators on some linear space. And what is that space? That is this Hilbert space. And when two operators, physical quantities are represented by operators which do not commute with each other, they cannot simultaneously have definite numerical values. So, the reason for introducing the concept of a pure state is to convey this fact that at a given time, at most, you will have you will be able to assign numerical values to, very roughly speaking, half the physical properties of the system. The other half cannot, very crudely, naively speaking. All right. So, in a general state, even that cannot be achieved. An impure state is a state in which you have less knowledge than is permitted by the principles of quantum mechanics. That can also happen. Even classically, the best knowledge permitted by theory is knowledge of the values of everything. An impure state classically would be a case where even that is not achieved. You know a few things, you don't know most other things. Values of. In quantum mechanics, already there is a restriction. The best possible knowledge of the state of a system already involves restrictions, which were not there classically. So, when you are operating at that level, you have a pure state. When you don't even have that much information, you have an impure state. Okay. So, general physical properties of a system, mechanical properties, maybe spin, maybe angular momentum, position, momentum, whatever you like, each one of them is described by a Hermitian operator on this Hilbert space. Once again, confession, we physicists, at least in my generation, were not taught very well the distinction between Hermitian and self-adjoint, things of this kind. And you know, you all know that in the early years, when you are between 2, 3, 4 and 5, you can learn 3 languages without difficulty, or even maybe 4 languages. But once you reach 25, 30, 35, one additional language is an insuperable barrier. So, many of us of our generation were introduced to more sophisticated and better quality mathematics late in life. And so, I have been struggling ever since. So, one should pay attention when you are dealing with infinite dimensional Hilbert space and unbounded operators. You must worry about domain of definition. You must worry about the subtle distinction between Hermitian, self-adjoint, etc., extension and so on. But I will omit all that. For finite dimensional systems and situations, these things do not matter, but they are very important for general quantum systems. Okay. So, with this background, let me say there is one special operator in the set of all operators on Hilbert space, which has a special name. It is called the Hamiltonian operator, and typically it is written as capital H, sometimes with a roof on top to tell you it's not a number, but it's an operator. It is, what happened? Just press it again. Oh, because it was unchanged for a long time. Yeah. So, there is one operator which is given a special role. It determines the equation of motion of quantum mechanics. Remember yesterday I talked about equations of motion of a classical system, and I said they come in 3 physically equivalent but mathematically different looking forms. I talked about the Newtonian equations of motion, the Euler-Lagrange equations of motion, and Hamilton's equations of motion. In a similar spirit, in quantum mechanics too, the equations of motion come in more than one form, and this is the form that was first discovered in 1926 by Erwin Schrödinger. So, this is called the Schrödinger time dependent equation. It is the equation of motion of quantum mechanics. You can say it is a quantum mechanical replacement for Newton's equations or Euler-Lagrange equations or Hamilton's equations, but there are other ways to handle that. Okay? So, this is 1926. So, why do I call it the equation of motion? Remember, here we say every vector psi in Hilbert space after normalization describes a state, a pure state. This equation tells you how does that pure state evolve in the course of time, and it is the special operator called the Hamiltonian which tells you how the system changes its properties in the course of time. Okay. So, this is the time dependent Schrödinger equation. It was written in this very concise and elegant form by Dirac when he wrote his book in 1930, The Principles of Quantum Mechanics. So now I jump immediately to the concept of symmetry for a quantum system. And you will see in some sense this connection between group action, group representation and quantum mechanics is easier. It is more easy to grasp than it was in the classical case. Suppose you have a Lie group, capital G, which is represented unitarily on the Hilbert space of the quantum system you are dealing with. We say that this group is a symmetry group if the Hamiltonian, the thing that determines the equation of motion, is invariant under the action of this representation. I hope the meaning is clear. So, what does it mean? A group, a Lie group G is a group of symmetries of the quantum system you are dealing with if and only if the Hamiltonian operator, which determines the equation of motion, commutes with the unitary operator u of G representing elements G, small g in capital G. So, this property tells you whether you are dealing with a symmetry property or not. So, supposing you have a Lie group which is a symmetry group of the system in this precise technical sense. So, then many results follow and I just mention them very briefly. The first statement is the following, which you can immediately verify. Suppose you have a solution of the quantum mechanical equation of motion. Suppose you have a vector psi as a function of time obeying this equation. Then what happened? Then you take that psi obeying the equation of motion and apply the unitary transformation u of G corresponding to any chosen element of your symmetry group. You will then get psi prime of t. Psi prime will also be a solution of the equation of motion because u of G commutes with the Hamiltonian. So, a symmetry group acts in such a way that it will map solutions of the equation of motion of quantum mechanics into other solutions in general. That is property number 1. Property number 2, since we are dealing with a Lie group, we have the notions of continuity. We can think of elements in the group very close to the identity, and you know this standard notation. I hope you are familiar with it. The unitary operators representing group elements very close to the identity can be expanded in a Taylor's type series. U of G is first the unit operator on the Hilbert space minus I alpha, which are local coordinates on the Lie group, times corresponding generators J with the subscript R. So, R is an index running from 1 up to the dimension of the group, and then there will be terms of order alpha squared and so on. So, the alphas are very small, very close to 0. So, because you are dealing with a unitary group representation and I have taken out this I factor, the J's are Hermitian, more precisely self-adjoint. So, I have indicated that here. So, unitarity of u of G leads to hermiticity of the generators. They obey commutation relations corresponding to the structure constants of G, and therefore, this is a realization, a Hermitian realization of the Lie algebra of the group. All right. There is this factor of I, and this is usually called the quantum mechanical I, like the Madras I, I suppose. So, we usually remove this factor of I explicitly so that the operator J then becomes Hermitian or self-adjoint. If U is unitary, J is Hermitian. And why is it useful to do so? Because physical properties are represented by Hermitian operators, not anti-Hermitian operators. So, the generators in principle, each one of them could represent some physical property of your system. The third consequence of a symmetry group is that each of these generators commutes with the Hamiltonian, the same as the statement that H is invariant under the action of the group. This has now the physical meaning every one of the operators J is a constant of motion. And I hope you remember this message from yesterday. For a classical system whose equations come from an action principle given by a Lagrangian, symmetries are generated by quantities which turn out to be constants of motion, and that was Noether's theorem. So, that happens to be true in quantum mechanics as well. The generators of the representation of G, the unitary representation of G, commute with the Hamiltonian, and this has the meaning in quantum mechanics too, that the J's are constants of motion. Now, I want to describe something very, very beautiful, whose beauty I have been appreciating only recently after retirement. This is the Wigner theorem on the representation of symmetry in quantum mechanics. Of course, I confess there is no time to describe in any detail the full physical interpretation of all the mathematical features of quantum mechanics. And by the way, this subject is now 86 years old. It was discovered in 1925-26, and a certain interpretation was given to quantum mechanics at that time. Even to this day, there are people who do not like that interpretation and who keep looking for alternative ways of interpreting the structure, the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics. So, this is only to say that by and large everybody accepts the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics, but there is a minority, you can say, that tries to interpret the mathematics in a way different from what is called the conventional interpretation. Actually, most practicing physicists do not worry about these things very much, but there are some who do work on these problems. This is just to tell you that the subject is not dead, and it just shows you how non-trivial a situation we are dealing with. Okay. So, now I said that I cannot, oh my God, time is passing very fast. I said that I cannot go into the physical interpretation in too much detail, but a little bit I must tell you. I think you all know that in the interpretation, in the conventional interpretation of quantum mechanics, probability plays a very important role. So, now I want to bring it in the context of the Wigner theorem. Suppose by some experimental procedure, you have prepared a quantum system to be in the pure state psi. So, psi is the result of preparation of the system. Having prepared it in that state, you now do an experiment. You are permitted to do an experiment and ask the question, what is the probability that the system prepared in state psi will be found later to be in the state phi? This is a legitimate question in quantum mechanics, and there is an answer. So, I agree, I repeat, psi is the result of preparation, phi is the result of an experiment. And you ask the question, if I know that it was in the state psi, and then I make an experiment and ask the question, is it in the state phi? There is a probability to make a transition from psi to phi. And quantum mechanics says that transition probability from an initial state psi to a final state phi is the magnitude squared of the Hilbert space inner product of phi with psi. Remember, the phi and psi are vectors of unit norm. Okay. So, this is the basic probability axiom of quantum mechanics, part of the conventional interpretation. Now, you can see that this probability is insensitive to changing the phase of psi or changing the phase of phi, because if you plug in an e to the power I alpha in front of psi here, it will come out of the inner product and it will get washed away when you take mod square. Okay. So, this is as we should expect, that these transition probabilities depend only on the pure physical states involved, they just ignore these phase factors. There is another way to make this more explicit, and that is to introduce the one dimensional projection operators onto psi or onto phi, and that I denote in this particular way, either as psi adjoint or in the Dirac notation. And so, the rho of psi is a one dimensional projection operator onto the vector psi, rho of phi is onto the vector phi. So, this transition probability to go from state psi to state phi is the trace of the product of the corresponding projection operators. Right. So, when written in this form, it is obvious that these phase factors will not affect the probability at all. Now, in this language, Wigner gave in 1934 a definition of symmetry in quantum mechanics. He said a symmetry operation in quantum mechanics is any invertible map capital omega on the space of one dimensional projection operators which preserves these transition probabilities. That was the definition given by Wigner in 1934. Now, since I have written all the equations and these sheets are with you, let me not go into more detail. You can read through what I have written. Let me come now to what he then found. So, all I want to emphasize is the way Wigner defined symmetry is as a map one-to-one onto an invertible map omega on the space of one dimensional projection operators onto Hilbert space, with the property that transition probabilities are invariant. So, you can say they are symmetries of the transition probability. So, then here is his theorem. Any symmetry in this sense is always the result of an operation which acts directly on Hilbert space. Either it is the result of a unitary transformation acting on Hilbert space, or it is the result of an anti-unitary operation acting on Hilbert space. So, this was Wigner's theorem of 1934. So, I will now limit myself to the unitary case. The anti-unitary option, by the way, this is called the Wigner alternative. Either a symmetry operation arises by starting with a unitary transformation on Hilbert space, or from an anti-unitary transformation. An anti-unitary is very rare. The only physical situation which involves it is time reversal. So, if you ignore that, then you do not have to worry about anti-unitary. Also, it is true that if you are dealing with a unitary representation of a Lie group, connected Lie group, you will never come across the anti-unitary option. Why? Because for a Lie group, the connected component, every element is the square of some other element, something of that kind you can say, and therefore, you limit yourself to unitary case. So, then, so this is the Wigner theorem. So, then you find, limiting ourselves to the unitary case, here is what happens. Every element of a symmetry group is represented by a unitary operator on Hilbert space, this is indicated here, and how do they compose with one another? When you analyze the theorem, you find all that you can claim is that if you take two elements of the group G and G prime, the corresponding unitary transformations may not be quite U of G prime G, they multiply to give you U of G prime G apart from a possible phase factor. So, Wigner's theorem tells you what you should look for fundamentally in quantum mechanics are so called ray representations, unitary ray representations of Lie groups, not true representations. So, if this phase factor is non-zero, you say you have a unitary ray representation of G, and quantum mechanics permits their use. In case omega is 0, then you have a true representation, or it is called a vector representation. Okay. Now, in this discussion so far, no Hamiltonian was involved, no equation of motion. It was a consequence of the definition of a symmetry as something which preserves transition probabilities. I might mention that the person who studied this ray representations of Lie groups in great detail and in a very, very beautiful paper was V. Bargmann, who wrote an important paper on this subject in 1957. So, this whole thing is called the Wigner-Bargmann analysis of symmetry in quantum mechanics. Again, Bargmann showed that in most of the cases that one deals with, for most of the physically important Lie groups, this phase factor can be eliminated. You have some freedom in the choice of this phase factor, and this is a co-cycle condition and the freedom to change omega and so on. So, there are hardly any situations in which non-trivial omegas remain, but where they remain, they are important. In any case, from this ray representation concept, you find if the composition law for the transformations of finite group elements is like this, the generators obey commutation relations corresponding to the Lie algebra of the group plus additional pieces. These are called neutral elements or extensions, you can say. These are the things that upon exponentiation lead to those phase factors. And you may remember, even in the classical case, such things had appeared. So, these are not specifically quantum mechanical in nature, they are important both classically and in quantum mechanics. They belong to the group, whether the group permits non-trivial extensions or not. Okay. So, now this has been a very general discussion. I have not talked of particular Lie groups. I wanted to give you an overall picture in what way quantum mechanics uses unitary Lie group representations. Now, I want to give you a feeling for more practical things. So, I will tell you very quickly about the important symmetry groups related to space-time. The motivation here is the following. In principle, for each given quantum mechanical system, there will be a corresponding symmetry group. All those transformations which commute with that Hamiltonian. But it is also true that if you are talking about the properties of the underlying space or underlying space-time, many physical systems would share the same symmetries, and these are the things that come from space-time symmetry groups. So, I will go over this rather quickly. Anyway, my notes are there, and the literature on all this is infinite. So, there is no difficulty. The first one I would talk about is the three-dimensional group of proper orthogonal rotations. This is, as you probably know, denoted by the symbol SO3. S is special for proper, O for orthogonal, and 3 is for the dimension. These transformations describe what we call physically the isotropy of space, namely that different directions in space are basically equivalent to one another. There is no preferred direction in space. This is at a fundamental level. Of course, on the surface of the earth, the vertical is distinguished from the horizontal, but that apart, intrinsically, all directions are the same, and that is called the isotropy. So, what is the definition of this group SO3? Here is what is called its defining representation. You can picture it as the group, as this collection of 3 by 3 real matrices capital A, which are orthogonal and have unit determinant. Of course, the group multiplication law is matrix multiplication, and so the inverse of an element A is its transposed matrix, and so on. As you know, as you should know, this is a Lie group, which is compact, it is order 3 and rank 1. Now, all this must come like music to your ears, order and rank and so on. And it is, what is it, simple, semi-simple, whatever you like to call it. Okay. In any unitary representation of this group, there will be Hermitian generators, 3 of them, J1, J2 and J3, which obey characteristic commutation relations. The structure constants for the group SO3 are the Levi-Civita symbol, epsilon RST, which is the completely antisymmetric symbol, with R, S and T running from 1, 2 to 3, and epsilon, it is normalized, so that epsilon 1, 2, 3 is taken to be plus 1. So, any system in quantum mechanics which exists in 3-dimensional space and which has this symmetry, which is invariant under all rotations in Euclidean 3-dimensional space, will involve some unitary representation of the group SO3. It will have some generators and they will be constants of motion, and physically speaking they are angular momentum, the 3 components of angular momentum. Okay. Who was the first person who drew attention to angular momentum in the history of physics? It is Johannes Kepler. With the second law of Kepler was the first time angular momentum was recognized in physics. Now, I talked about the Wigner theorem and representations up to phase factors. That is very important here. It turns out that to describe rotational symmetry in quantum mechanics, it is not enough to deal with unitary representations of the group SO3. I will cut a long story short and say you must allow unitary representations of the universal covering group of SO3. Is that notion familiar to everybody? Universal covering group. Not anyway, I am operating at the limit of my knowledge of mathematics. I want to impress you, but I can't go beyond that. All right. So, anyway, the fact is, in quantum mechanics, to describe the action of rotations in physical 3-dimensional space, one has to use unitary representations of a group called SU2. Is that group known? SU2, unitary unimodular group in complex matrices in 2 dimensions. So, you may wonder why, when you are talking about rotations in 3 dimensions, why are you asking me to worry about SU2 and its representations? It is because of the Wigner theorem. Because Wigner's theorem says you must not, to begin with, restrict yourself to unitary representations of the rotation group. You must allow representations up to phase factors. But those phase factors have certain amount of flexibility. You can try to simplify them, you can even try to eliminate them if possible. In the case of rotations SO3, it is not possible to eliminate those phase factors completely. After maximum simplification, you are left with a plus minus ambiguity, which corresponds to the statement that you have to go to the group SU2, the universal covering group of SO3. Here I just wanted to, I made a note of a very interesting thing. Because you are all students in India, you must be aware of our own heritage. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, 3 very remarkable mathematicians were working together in the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. You know their names? I hope you know. K.R. Parthasarathi, who is in Delhi ISI, V.S. Varadarajan, who is in where? UCLA, and who is the third person, third musketeer? K. Rangarao. So, these 3 people, it is amazing that they were working on Barakpur Trunk Road. What were they doing? They were studying the great results of Harishchandra on the representations of what compact semi-simple Lie groups, whatever it is, you know, or the great work of Harishchandra. And I mention it because out of these 3 people, Rangarao has, well, I learnt many of these things from K.R. Parthasarathi. Rangarao has done a lot of work on this phase factor ray representations and how to what extent this Wigner phase factor can be simplified. I will tell you later a specific case where Ranga Rao has done very nice work not long ago. All right. So, just a repetition. Rotational invariance in quantum mechanics uses unitary representations not just of the rotation group SO3, but also of its double covering group SU2. Okay. Next space related group is a Euclidean group in 3 dimensions. It is written as E3. It expresses the properties of isotropy, which we already discussed, and homogeneity. That is the statement that all locations in 3-dimensional physical space are basically equivalent. So, this group consists of 2 kinds of transformations. One is rotations SO3, which we already saw. The other is translations in space, rigid changes, shifting of the origin of a Cartesian coordinate system. So, you can say that a general element of the Euclidean group is written as a pair, capital A and a 3 vector small a. Capital A is a rotation, proper rotation, little a vector is a translation. You take a Cartesian coordinate system with some origin, bodily shift it. So, these transformations, this is how it acts on the coordinates of a point. X goes to x prime in this way, it is all in the notes, and here is a composition law which you read off from this action. And for any system which has the Euclidean group as its symmetry group, you will deal with unitary representations of this group, and it will have 6 generators. Why? Because it is a 6 parameter Lie group. Of course, this is semi-direct product. So, there is an invariant piece and a factor and so on. So, this is not semi-simple. Okay. But it is important. It describes the basic properties of Euclidean geometry, homogeneity and isotropy of space. And what is the physical meaning of the generators? The J's again are the angular momenta, the P's are the linear momenta. Okay. The next group in this list is the Galilei group. This is the group which is basic to the non-relativistic mechanics discovered by Galileo and Newton. It is a Lie group, it is of dimension 10. And it has a very, very intricate structure. I will not go into I will not repeat all these details, you can read them. The most important thing to know is what is it made up of. It is made up of 4 kinds of transformations. 1, rotations in 3-dimensional space. 2, translations of the origin in 3-dimensional space. 3, translations in the origin of the time variable. You can say time is 0 now, or you can shift the point to which you assign time 0. And the 4th one is Galileo's discovery. These are transformations from one coordinate system to another in uniform relative motion. So, these are called Galilean velocity transformations. So, elements of the Galilei group are sets of 4 quantities, capital A rotation, V a relative velocity, B a translation in time, A translation in space. And here is how the coordinates and spatial coordinates and the time of an event change under an element of the Galilei group. Okay. So, I will not go further into detail, just a historical comment. See, next I am going to talk about special relativity. The analysis of special relativity in quantum mechanics was begun in the 1930s, and it was understood quite well by the 40s and 50s. After that experience, people went back to non-relativistic mechanics and the Galilei group and started asking, how is the Galilei group of non-relativistic physics represented in quantum mechanics? This is a historical accident. You would imagine that one would have learnt all about non-relativistic mechanics first before going into special relativity, but in actual fact it happened the other way. And the other passing comment is that the Galilei group is the only important group from the physics point of view in which that Wigner phase factor allows a highly non-trivial phase. And that phase, that non-trivial phase is the, you can say, the source of the concept of mass of a particle. Okay? So, there is so much physics hidden in all this group theory in the framework of quantum mechanics. The last one is the Poincare group. This is the one basic to special relativity. Here, as you probably know, space combined with time is pictured mathematically as R4. And along with the R4, you have a metric which is not quite Euclidean, it is called pseudo-Euclidean, and in physics language it is called the Minkowski metric. So, if you will not mind, I will not go into any details about the Poincare group, only to say a couple of things, and then I want to come to my last topic, which I think will be some interest to you. This Poincare group is what describes the properties of space and time as perceived in the special theory of relativity. This group, usually denoted by script P, is a semi-direct product of two parts. One part is translations in space and time, the other part is what are called homogeneous Lorentz transformations. This is also written as SO3,1. It is almost like rotations in 4 real dimensions, so you call it a pseudo rotation group. And here are all the composition rules and so on, so forth. All I would like to say at this point, and then I go on to my last topic, is the classic study of the unitary representations of the Poincare group was completed by Wigner in the year 1939. It's a very special year because I was born that year. Also, Second World War started in September of that year. It appears that in 1930 or so, Dirac suggested to Wigner that he attack this problem. And in one of Wigner's letters to Dirac, he says, you have told me to be careful in analyzing the unitary representations of the Poincare group. I promise you I will be careful. This is a great classic of mathematical physics. It's written in a beautiful style. It's very difficult to go through it. It's a very long paper. It is what is it? Annals of Mathematics, 1939. So, this was the basis of the understanding the unitary representations of the Poincare group for the purposes of quantum mechanics. It did not succeed in finding all the representations, but it laid out a beautiful procedure, and the procedure is called what the Frobenius procedure, the idea of stability group and so on, very, very beautifully used by Wigner. So, it is a classic. And as I said earlier, relativistic quantum mechanics, the group theoretical aspects were examined and understood by around that time, 1939. The corresponding treatment of the non-relativistic Galilei group came 10-15 years later. Probably the interest was somewhat academic. Now, I want to come to my last point, which I hope you will find quite interesting. As I mentioned at the beginning, my purpose in yesterday's and today's talks has only been to show you a few aspects of the uses of Lie groups, Lie algebras, and their representations in physics. And I have not gone into too many explicit examples except for these 4 space-time related groups. It is generally true in physical applications, whether you talk of atomic physics, chemical physics, molecular, particle physics, the real orthogonal groups SON, I hope that is known for various dimensions, and the great family of unitary unimodular groups SUN, these are crucial for physics. They are very heavily used in many, many situations in all areas, quantum optics also. Of course, not for all n. All right, for each physical situation. In particle physics, the largest group used is probably SO10 in various conjectures. All right. So, but the US Army is probably interested in SON for all n. So, instead of describing all these uses, I want to conclude with a particular class of semi-simple non-compact Lie groups which are important in both quantum mechanics and optics, and they are relatively unfamiliar to most physicists. And I thought that you may find this quite appealing. This is the family of groups called the real symplectic groups, sp2nr. This is the notation, the groups sp2nr, and they are family of matrix groups defined only in real even dimensional spaces, and this probably the definition is known to all of you. Now, how do these groups appear in quantum mechanics and why? Well, I mentioned earlier in the beginning of today's lecture that for each given quantum system, the construction of the Hilbert space is based upon finding an irreducible representation of some system of operators obeying some relations. They may be commutation relations, they may be anti-commutation relations, some operator relations. Now, the first examples of quantum systems involved what is called the Heisenberg algebra. What does this mean? You imagine a system, go back to classical mechanics, imagine a system whose configuration space is n-dimensional Euclidean space, Rn. The corresponding phase space is the cotangent bundle on Q, it is basically R2n, Euclidean real 2n dimensional space. When you have such a system in quantum mechanics, what is the corresponding Hilbert space? It turns out to be the space of all square integrable functions on Rn. So, this is the Hilbert space that is required for the quantum mechanics of all those systems whose classical configuration space is Rn. Now, what is this family of commutation relations which is unitarily represented here on this Hilbert space? These are the so called Heisenberg canonical commutation relations. These are now quite familiar to many mathematicians as well. What is involved is a set of Hermitian operators written as Q, they represent position, and you have Q1, Q2 up to Qn, and they are all Hermitian, strictly self-adjoint, they are all unbounded operators. Then along with them, you have n momenta, P1, P2 up to Pn, also Hermitian. And what are the commutation, what are the algebraic relations? These are the Heisenberg relations. Q with P commutator is I or minus I or 0, depending on the indices. Any two Q's commute and any two P's commute. All right. So, this system of commutation relations, well, it was discovered in bits and pieces in the period 1925-1926, and Hermann Weyl also contributed a lot to this development. So, sometimes you call this the Heisenberg-Weyl system. So, these commutation relations have to be represented in an irreducible fashion on the Hilbert space, and that can be done. Now, these commutation relations can be written in a very compact, very concise form. I introduce a 2n component symbol xi, A goes from 1 to 2n. The first n of the xi's will be the q's, the last n will be the p's. So, if you introduce this kind of notation to go from n component quantities to 2n component quantities, the Heisenberg commutation relations take a very nice appearance. The xi's, there are 2n of them now, they are each one of them Hermitian self-adjoint. Their commutation relations, commutator of one psi with another psi is a number Most of the time it is 0, sometimes it is plus I, sometimes it is minus I. So, it can be written as a 2n dimensional matrix given a special name. It is called the symplectic metric. So, once you have the commutation relations in this form, you can immediately convince yourself, if you perform linear transformations on the xi's, replace psi by psi prime equal to S A B psi B, where S's are real numbers. So, capital S is a matrix of 2n dimensions. The commutation relations will be preserved if S obeys this condition, S beta S transpose equals beta. So, you have a family of linear transformations on the basic Q and P operators which preserves the Heisenberg commutation relations. This property leads to the definition of the groups SP2 and R. This group of matrices defined only in even dimensions consists of all real 2n by 2n matrices obeying this condition, S beta S transpose equals beta. You can see this is a variation of the Euclidean definition of an orthogonal rotation. If there was no beta, S would have been a real orthogonal transformation. Now, the beta changes everything, and so from Euclidean geometry you go to something called symplectic geometry. Now, going back to the Heisenberg relations, there is a theorem of Stone and von Neumann from 1930 or so, which says these Heisenberg relations possess only one irreducible representation up to equivalence. You do not have many representations, only one. Okay, so if that is so, what happened? If that is so, since the commutation relations of psi prime are the same as those of psi, since you have the Stone-von Neumann theorem, psi prime must be related to psi by a unitary transformation. It must be the result of conjugation by some unitary operator. So, you come to the conclusion that take a real symplectic matrix, apply it to psi, get psi prime. Each psi prime A must be some unitary operator u times psi A times u inverse. So, I want to repeat, the group is obtained by simply asking for linear transformations under which these commutation relations are preserved. Once you have such a linear transformation, you appeal to the Stone-von Neumann theorem, and then you find every element of the symplectic group must bring with it a unitary operator on Hilbert space implementing this change from psi to psi prime by a conjugation. Then you come to the conclusion by looking at this, will these unitary operators give you a unitary representation of this group? No, they give you a representation up to phases, because obviously the u of s's are each one determined only up to a phase, because only u psi u inverse appears. Moreover, for the same reason, you find in general for two elements of the symplectic group, the product of the corresponding unitary transformations is in general some phase factor times u of s prime s. This is what, so I would like you to work this out for yourself. Now, a few historical comments. This ambiguity of phases and the maximum extent to which it can be simplified has been analyzed in great care and detail by K. Rangarao. This is in a paper about 10-12 years ago, very nice paper. I have not read it in full, but I know he has looked at this very carefully. The fact that these operators will give you only a representation of the group sp2nr up to a plus minus sign was recognized by André Weil, not Hermann Weil, but André Weil, the French mathematician, and he gave a name for this. What you are dealing with here is a unitary representation not of the group sp2nr, but a double covering of sp2nr to accommodate this plus minus sign. That group was given a name by Andre Weil. It has been called the metaplectic group. I don't know more about it. All I know is that the operators U of S can be adjusted so that they give a two-valued unitary representation of the symplectic group, or better, a true unitary representation of the so-called metaplectic group. All this, and as I written here, it was discovered by Andre Weil. I don't remember now, sometime in the 40s. In some of our papers, you will find the reference to his paper. This unitary representation of the metaplectic group, it is very useful in quantum mechanics, where Heisenberg variables play a role. It is useful also in classical optics, in quantum optics, but I feel that generally physicists are not very familiar with this. So, some years ago, Simon, Datta, Arvind and myself, we wrote a simple pedagogical review of the symplectic groups and this Weil representation, Andre Weil representation, in a short review, user-friendly review in Pramana. I don't remember now, 10 years, 11 years ago, but it is easy for you to trace it. So, I thought that I should show one example of this kind, a particular family of groups which are very interesting from the physics point of view, and I hope it arouses your curiosity. And I have also shown you where it is that Ranga Rao has done a very nice analysis. So, now concluding remarks, I hope these two lectures, which have been given in a purely pedagogical fashion, have been of some interest to you, and I encourage you to explore these ideas, these things further on your own. As I said, the literature on the uses of group theory in quantum mechanics is enormous, and so at least with what I have presented to you, maybe you will have some orientation, and then you will find a direction in which to go in this jungle, and then read things and think about things which are of interest to you. So, thanks again to Raghavan for giving me this chance to give these two lectures. Thank you very much. Yes. This one, the last one. Yeah.
Your definition of symmetry in this, as you defined it, so it's something which preserves the relations amongst those operators that
Yeah, it is in this particular case, I am not talking of any particular system or any Hamiltonian. I am talking more generally. This is called the kinematical analysis of the system, not the dynamics. So, the Hilbert space is built up so as to give you an irreducible representation of this system of commutation relations, the Heisenberg commutation relations. And this is a symmetry group of those commutation relations.
So, it's, so if in fact there were a system with some Hamiltonian in which I don't quite understand how these operators are related.
So, so you first please accept that this analysis is kinematic. It tells you how the Hilbert space is built up, why does it carry a unitary representation of this particular group, what are the ingredients, the Heisenberg-Weil commutation relations and the Stone-von Neumann theorem, which says those relations have only one irreducible representation up to unitary equivalence. So, any transformation of the xi's to xi primes which preserves those relations must be unitarily implemented. That is the Stone-von Neumann theorem. Therefore, since the sp2nr matrices are designed to preserve the commutation relations, your Hilbert space must carry a unitary representation of this group up to phase factors. So,
if there were a Hamiltonian, this would also preserve that.
now I come to the Hamiltonian. any particular system would be described by a specific Hamiltonian. No Hamiltonian of interest will have this as its symmetry group, because it has no invariance of any interest from that point of view. This is an irreducible well, it's not quite irreducible, it is the representation of the metaplectic group which one finds here is unitary reducible. Upon reduction, it has two irreducible pieces. This is all things found by Andre Weil and company. So, there is no interesting Hamiltonian which will have this as its symmetry group, but every Hamiltonian of physical importance will behave in an interesting way under the transformations of this group. It may not be invariant, but it will behave in a way which you can use profitably to analyze its properties. So, that is the reason why this is important. In this particular case, we are dealing, you asked a good question, very good question. We are dealing with the symmetry group of the fundamental commutation relations, and we say that is a kinematics problem. We are not dealing with the symmetry of a specific physical system, which would mean a specific Hamiltonian. Okay? So, it is like going down to the Wigner level. The Wigner definition of symmetry was a purely kinematic analysis. It said symmetries are operations which preserve transition probabilities. It did not talk of a Hamiltonian of one system or another, or an equation of motion. So, in that spirit, this is the Wigner kind of approach. So, still it is useful, because any practically useful, interesting Hamiltonian will transform in some interesting way under these things, and its properties with respect to this group can be used for calculational purposes. Okay. Yeah.
There's something like point symmetry.
Huh? Point symmetry meaning? I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Q. The Q you used yesterday for configurations.
Point transformations. Yeah, sure. E3, the Euclidean group, the rotation group are all point transformation symmetries.
No, when you say kinematic.
No, when you talk of point transformation symmetries, those are symmetries which are definable by their action on configuration space. All right? That is the definition of point transformation symmetry. Kinematics in today's discussion means not referring to a particular Hamiltonian, referring to the overall basic structures of quantum mechanics. The Hilbert space, where does it come from? What are the operators which are represented on it? What are their commutation relations? Before you choose a Hamiltonian. That is what I meant by kinematic here. So, meanings are slightly different. Yeah.
But the contact transformation preserves the Poisson pattern.
Say that again.
The contact transformation preserves the Poisson pattern.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, isn't it similar to this here?
Wait, by contact, do you really mean what we would say canonical, or do you insist on contact? Canonical trans. Yeah.
Therefore, they should be similar to that.
Say that.
This one, which you have
Yeah.
written down,
Yeah.
is also keeping the same.
Yeah.
pattern.
So these are linear canonical transformations. Linear canonical. No, that's not the same thing. Point transformations are transformations which act on configuration space and map it into itself or onto itself. These things, yeah, please. These can, in general, see, the new Q is a linear combination of old Q and old P.
So, it is like symplectic.
It is the symplectic group. Oh boy. See the. I remember a sentence from my youth which said that every generation of theoretical physicists thinks that the next generation is too mathematical. So I see it happening here. Yes, please.
So I would like to understand a little bit more about
Please.
what you said about the double cover of SO3.
SO3, yeah.
And why it is that the representations of the double cover
Are used
are
need.
useful? Why?
Ah.
Why it comes to? Because we just understand it as a looping SO3. When you actually do it twice, you can come back to the same thing.
Yeah.
What's the physical significance?
Yeah, I just wonder if my colleagues, Professor Mani and Govind, can try to answer his question.
Why representations of the double cover of SO? In SO3, okay, I understand as this rigid transformations, rotations of your physical space. But why is the double cover of that group? Why does it come here?
Well, it turns out that particles have not just angular momentum, but also some kind of intrinsic angular momentum or spin.
Okay, I mean, I was just looking for a little more insight. I mean, that's what I read, that this is cited by Dirac to explain that the spin can be half, but not any other fraction, right?
Okay, I will try to answer you also. It is that if a quantum mechanical system is invariant under the operations of the elements of some group, those elements of the symmetry group will be represented by unitary transformations on the Hilbert space. And then you ask, if I take two different elements of the group, how can I compose the corresponding unitary transformations? Do they give a unitary representation of the group? Right away the answer is no. The result of composing two unitary transformations, u of G1 and u of G2, can differ from u of G1, G2 by a phase factor. Quantum mechanics does not require unitary representations of symmetry groups. It requires unitary ray representations up to phase factors. Okay. So, the fact that three-dimensional rotations are a symmetry for the hydrogen atom or for the electron, etc., does not require that you must work with unitary representations of SO3. It says, quantum mechanics says, you must work with unitary representations up to phase factors. Right? This is the key physical result. Now, it turns out that for most of the groups we are familiar with, the semi-simple and so on, representations up to phase factors always arise from true representations of the universal cover, which is simply connected. For SO3, what is the universal cover? SU2 is a double cover. So, quantum mechanics will say, for describing the properties of rotations on quantum systems, please use true unitary representations of SU2. If that happens to be a representation of SO3, well and good, but it may not be. When it is not, we physicists say it is almost a representation. We say it is a double valued representation. Strictly, it is not a representation of SO3, but what I want to convey is that this flexibility, you can say, comes from the basic ingredients of quantum mechanics. The fact that a vector psi and a phase factor times psi are physically indistinguishable. Remember first transparency today. Every vector psi of unit norm determines a pure physical state. E to the power I alpha times psi, same physical state as psi. You cannot, so vectors in Hilbert space do not correspond in a one-to-one manner to physical states. There is this phase factor which is ambiguous. That ambiguity, that freedom shows up in the group representation. The composition law allows for phases.
But shouldn't the Lie algebras be the same dimension? SO2 and SO3 would be the
Yeah,
same.
yeah, it's a discrete cover. So,
But but for your generators, the relation, even at the Lie algebra level, you seem to have that extra commutation relations between the
yeah.
J's.
Yeah.
You seem to have an extra factor in addition to just the usual bracket. Is that some kind of?
I'll tell you now. I must say I am very less tired today than yesterday because you are asking so many nice questions. In the case of SO3 and SU2, the commutation relations are identical. Structure constants are the same because locally they are isomorphic to one another, right? SU2 and SO3. The difference is only global. This phase factor omega, which appears in the Wigner theorem, that the composition u of g prime u of g can differ from u g prime g by some phase factor. In all these cases, it can be shown, it can be reduced to a plus minus ambiguity, which means in a neighborhood of the identity there is no difference. The minus sign will show up if you go sufficiently far away in the group manifold. So, the commutation relations are unchanged. So, for these two groups certainly SO3 and SU2, that DRS is not there. The DRS is the infinitesimal version of the phase omega. It will be there only if you see the phase even in the neighborhood of the identity. If it is not visible in the neighborhood of the identity, there is no DRS.
It's not a discrete
Huh?
So the universal cover is not it's a covering, then in some sense locally it's
Yeah, so in these cases it is a discrete cover.
DRS would be non-zero
If it, as Govind says, if it were a central extension.
so it's a central extension at the level of the D algebra also.
So, in the case of the Galilei group, that is the best known and only known physical example. It turns out that the unitary ray representations of the Galilei group involve commutation relations which depart from the Lie algebra. In certain relations, extra pieces are there at the Lie algebra level. And as I said earlier, the concept of mass in non-relativistic mechanics comes through those pieces, but that is a bit technical. I do not expect you to understand. So, are cakes and ale waiting for us? Okay. Thank you.